The Giants' most important defensive line story might be hiding at the bottom of the roster. Not because Anquin Barnes Jr. is already a star. Not because he is guaranteed a spot. Because players like Barnes reveal whether John Harbaugh's Giants are truly changing. The headline names get the attention. The draft picks get the graphics. The familiar veterans get the debate. But the foundation of a real roster is built in the uncomfortable places. The last defensive tackle spot. The final special teams role. The camp rep that decides whether a young player is just a name or a problem for somebody ahead of him. That overlay matters because nobody is paying attention to this the right way. Anquin Barnes Jr. is not just a camp body if the Giants mean what they say about competition. He is a test. And if he passes it, the defensive line room changes. Let's be honest about where things stand. The holes are clear, and this is where it gets real. The Giants cannot build a tougher identity if the bottom of the roster stays soft. They cannot talk about physicality and then treat defensive line depth like an afterthought. They cannot ask Jackson Dart to grow as the current starting quarterback while the team keeps losing hidden roster margins everywhere else. A young quarterback needs a team that can control games. That starts with the trenches. And the Giants' defensive line room still has questions behind the obvious names. Who gives them effort when the rotation gets tired? Who survives camp when the pads come on? Who can absorb ugly snaps without the whole front falling apart? Who becomes more than a practice name? That phrase matters because defensive line depth is not a luxury. It is protection against collapse. When depth fails, the whole defense feels it. There is also a roster culture problem. For years, Giants fans have watched too many bottom-of-roster spots feel predetermined. A player gets a label, and that label follows him. Draft pick, veteran, depth guy, camp body. Harbaugh cannot let that happen. If this is really a shift in philosophy, then the back end of the roster has to be alive. That means undrafted players cannot be decorative. They have to make people uncomfortable. And that is the tension with Anquin Barnes Jr. He is not famous enough to get the benefit of the doubt. He is not protected by draft status. He has to force the staff to notice. If he does not, he disappears into the normal summer churn. If he does, Big Blue may have found something. And that brings us to the overlooked name sitting right in the middle of this camp battle. Anquin Barnes Jr. could be the hidden defensive tackle gem the Giants need people to start watching. That does not mean he is already penciled into the roster. That does not mean fans should crown him before training camp. It means his opportunity has real weight. Big Blue View framed the question perfectly. Can Anquin Barnes Jr. find a home on the New York Giants defensive line? That is not a throwaway question. That is the question every serious roster builder asks after the draft. Because once the obvious picks are made, the real scouting department gets judged by the margins. That overlay matters because undrafted free agents live in a different world. They do not get patience. They do not get long runway. They get moments. A rep, a drill, a preseason snap, a coach pausing the film and saying, "Run that back." That is the entire game for Barnes. And I love this kind of story because it strips away the hype. There is no safe talking point here. There is no easy superstar projection. This is football evaluation in its rawest form. Can he hold up? Can he flash? Can he make the defensive line coach keep watching? Can he become useful enough that cutting him feels uncomfortable? That is the standard. The Giants are hoping to strike gold with their collection of undrafted free agents. That phrase is important because it tells us how the front office is approaching this phase. They are not just filling camp numbers. They are searching. And when a team is searching, a player like Barnes has a real opening. This is not cosmetic. Defensive tackle depth can change the way a defense survives a season. If the starters need breathers, somebody has to take those snaps. If injuries hit, somebody has to step into the rotation. If the front wants to stay physical late in games, the back end of the room cannot be empty. That is why Barnes matters. Not because he has to be the next great Giant. Because he can make the room harder to cut. And that is how real teams are built. The best rosters do not only win at the top. They win when the unknown player forces his way into the conversation. This is where John Harbaugh's identity becomes more than a press conference. If Harbaugh is serious, Barnes gets a real chance to compete. If Barnes is good enough, draft status should not matter. If he is not good enough, move on. But do not pretend the opportunity is meaningless. This is the part nobody is talking about. A hidden defensive tackle pushing the roster is exactly the kind of small story that tells you whether the Giants are finally building a harder football team. That is the locker room test. Now let's talk about the wider UDFA fight around him. Barnes is the defensive line name, but he is not alone in the larger test. The Giants' undrafted class has multiple players trying to turn the bottom of the roster into a real competition. The Athletic pointed to a running back, a cornerback, and a pair of specialists as players with some of the best chances to make John Harbaugh's roster. That number matters because it shows this is not one random player trying to get noticed. It is a whole group fighting to turn opportunity into leverage. And that is where the mosaic starts to make sense. If a running back can pressure the depth chart, if a cornerback can make defensive coaches think twice, and if specialists can force roster math, then Barnes has to be judged inside that same environment. This is a competition ecosystem. Everybody is trying to steal a job. Everybody is trying to create a role. Everybody is trying to prove the Giants should not simply default to the safest name. And that is exactly what Harbaugh should want. Because culture is not built by slogans. Culture is built when the last player on the roster believes the staff will reward him if he earns it. That is why I keep coming back to Barnes. A defensive tackle UDFA is the perfect test case. He is not a glamour player. He is not a fantasy football name. He is not going to dominate national debate. But if he flashes, it means the Giants are finding value in the dirt. And that is how you rebuild a football team with toughness. The G-men do not need every undrafted player to become a starter. That is not realistic. They need one or two of them to make the roster harder, cheaper, younger, and more competitive. That is the emotional translation of this whole UDFA story. When an undrafted player makes a roster, it is not just a feel-good moment. It means somebody with more status got pushed. It means the coaching staff saw enough to make a difficult decision. That is what Barnes has to chase. Not hype. A difficult decision. If he becomes that, the defensive line room gets sharper. And when you combine that with the way the Giants' old roster era is fading, Barnes starts to feel like part of a bigger turn. The Russell Wilson story is not the headline. It should not be the headline. But it proves how fast the Giants' roster timeline is turning over. Wilson, whose most recent NFL stop was with the New York Giants, is reportedly in talks to go into television while he contemplates the end of his playing career. That matters because it shows how quickly names move from roster debate to football memory. One season, a player is part of the conversation. Then suddenly, the league keeps moving. And that is exactly why the Barnes story matters. The Giants cannot live on old names forever. They cannot build the next version of Big Blue by staring backward. They need the next wave. Some of that next wave comes from premium picks. Some of it comes from obvious roster moves. But some of it has to come from the overlooked players who win jobs nobody expected them to win. That is why Anquin Barnes Jr. is not just filler. He represents the doorway between the past and the next roster. Russell Wilson possibly moving toward television is a reminder that football turns fast. The roster does not wait. The league does not pause. The Giants have to keep finding players who fit where the team is going, not where it has been. And Barnes fits the question of the summer. Can an overlooked defensive tackle become useful enough to matter? That is the proof. The Giants are not just collecting names. They are testing functions. And Barnes has a chance to prove his function in the trenches. Hot take. Anquin Barnes Jr. will become one of the 5 most important camp names for Giants fans who actually understand roster construction. And I am not backing down from that. That number matters because I am not saying he is one of the 5 best players. I am saying his roster battle tells us more than people realize. My prediction is specific. Barnes will make the defensive line room uncomfortable before final cuts. If I am wrong, I will come back to this video and own it. But I do not think I am wrong. Here is the divisive part. I would rather see the Giants keep one young, hungry defensive tackle who earns a role than protect a safer name who does not change the room. That is not sentimental. That is football. John Harbaugh's standard cannot just apply to the easy decisions. It has to apply to the bottom of the depth chart, where real competition either lives or dies. Barnes does not need a crown. He needs a door. And if he kicks that door open, the Giants better not pretend they did not hear it. Big Blue is not rebuilt by headlines alone. It is rebuilt when overlooked players make comfortable rooms uncomfortable. That is the identity statement. Anquin Barnes Jr. may be a long shot, but long shots are exactly where a serious staff proves its standard. So Giants fans, pick a side. Is Barnes a real hidden gem who can push for the roster? Or is this just classic UDFA hype before camp gets real? And be honest, do you want Harbaugh to reward upside and hunger, or play it safe with the familiar names? If you are riding with the New York Football Giants through every roster battle, every camp sleeper, and every trench fight, you know where that subscribe button is. This is where the real rebuild gets tested. Go Big Blue.